Hello, and welcome to my presentation on South Korea and the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is a really important war for South Korea. It's a turning point for the nation, and I'm going to be looking at how South Korea impacted the war as a support for the American forces, and then how the war impacted South Korea politically, economically, and socially, both during the war itself and then afterwards into the present day. Now, in the early 1960s, when the South Koreans first got involved in Vietnam, the nation was still pretty young. The Korean War had just armistice in 1955, and the peninsula had been divided, and the two countries are in competition at this time. They're both still modernizing, and South Korea is in a lot of debt. And there's a very strong anti-communist sentiment in it that their president Park Chung-hee is stoking. So when Lyndon B. Johnson calls up Park asking if he will help the Vietnam cause as part of his Free World Assistance Program, Park, thinking that it's a good opportunity to make some money, is very ready to go, provided that the Americans pay for him to deploy troops. In 1964, there were 140 troops originally, 130 medical personnel, and 10 karate advisors. A 2,000-man Dove unit consisting of engineers and transportation experts would follow this. And then in 1965, you're going to get another 20,000 troops. And these are regulars. These are combat men. And then between 65 and 73, you're going to get over 300,000 South Korean troops in Vietnam as part of the war on the American side. And this is a very significant number for South Korea. This is proportional to their population, more troops than America sent. As I said before, the South Koreans were in Vietnam as a support to the Americans. They were known especially for their very precise strategizing, but they were also very known for being inflexible and tended not to capitalize on sudden opportunities if it weren't in the plan they had laid out for a certain operation. They were very good at the operations they did conduct, though it took them a long time to plan them. They were known for taking weeks or even months to gather intelligence, and this probably wouldn't have been able to be a realistic model of operation if they were not support troops for the U.S. The 1968 reports of Piers and Blanchard both describe the Korean troops in very highly positive terms. They talk about their ability to conduct night ambushes very well against the Viet Cong, as well as their cordon and search techniques in which they leave no stone unturned and do not allow any room for escape to any North Vietnamese or Viet Cong operatives. The 1971 report of one DeWitt is a bit different, though. It's possible that in 1968, Piers and Blanchard were somewhat looking to please their higher-ups and just keep things nice and steady, whereas in 71, when people were growing more disillusioned with the war, you're going to get DeWitt, who is going to have a much more nuanced and realistic take on their role. He notes that they rely on U.S. helicopters a lot, and he also notes that they have no time for anyone telling them what to do, especially ARVN officers, who they regard as incompetent and do not get along with at all. They were known for actually strong-arming ARVN out of control of occupied areas, to the point that the U.S. Department of State thought it could be a serious problem toward the collaborative efforts of ARVN, U.S., and ROK forces. Interestingly enough, the North Vietnamese were reported to actively avoid engaging ROK troops, and if that doesn't speak volumes about their effectiveness, I don't know what does. The relationship between Korean troops and South Vietnamese civilians is a very ambiguous one. There are reports of them trying to win a political war, helping villages and villagers, but there are also reports of them killing villagers indiscriminately when they can't tell whether they're Viet Cong or just civilians. In fact, civilian casualties in South Korean operations during the war get to be so much of a problem that Chai Myung-shin actually has to issue instructions against killing Vietnamese civilians. South Korean troops did commit massacres in a very similar way to American troops. In February of 1968, there was a massacre in Phong-Ni Hamlet in which 69 civilians were rounded up and shot. It was a precursor to the American My Lai incident, and interestingly enough, there are parallels. You have the three groups, and it takes a long time for this to really get back to the States as an action that has happened. The South Korean commander-in-chief Chiang Mung-shin actually denies that this happened at all. He claims that it was a diversion elected and mercilessly carried out by the communists, even though a village elder had testified to Rand Corporation that the aggressors of the massacre spoke Korean. The massacres do embarrass the ROC government, and for a long time, research on the Vietnam War is banned, and that's a contributing factor to the silence around the war in South Korean society today. As the war drew to a close, South Koreans evacuated from Vietnam more slowly than the Americans. They didn't leave fully until 1973, and part of that is that Nixon is trying to get Park to forcibly cover the American retreat, even though he probably didn't need to. As I said before, Park was really looking to make money off this war and wanted to be in it for as long as possible. This kind of sours the relationship between America and South Korea, and Park feels that he can no longer rely on America to protect him from the North. With Americans being pulled off the Korean peninsula, Park is nervous about North Korean attacks, so he convinces the Americans to agree to a military modernization program, part of their mutual assistance program, in which they provide hardware and training to the South Korean military in order for it to be more self-sufficient against any potential threat held by the North. The Vietnam War does do its job in terms of deterring any northern attacks. There are a few provocations that the North does. Most notably, they capture the American naval craft USS Pueblo, which is going to be a partial contribution to the decision to declare his Yushin regime, in which he becomes a fascist dictator and rules the state with micro-censorship and colludes with corporate entities until his assassination in 1979. Economically, the Vietnam War is really the beginning of the Miracle on the Han, the industrialization of South Korea in the second half of the 20th century. Between 1965 and 1968, imports grew by 100% and exports grew by 300%. This was due to American agreements about aid loans, about procurements, about development contracts, and then of course just paying for the Korean troops themselves. This is when South Korea really begins to pull ahead of North Korea and become the whale that it is. Despite the importance of the Vietnam War to South Korean society, it's the foundation of the economy. It's what really kickstarts that modernization process. It's what helps the country to see that it can stand on its own 2 feet as a superpower, and it's what contributes to defensive nationalism. And despite all this, the Vietnam War is still largely neglected. And this is very bad. If South Korea can't acknowledge and digest its own history, then it risks making the same mistakes over and over again in the